Okay, so we are going to be working this vector-based project. We're going to be working with Illustrator. First thing, typically when I work with Illustrator, I like to go to the workspace, and I typically work in Essentials Classic. It's just my preference, but if it helps you, especially working through these tutorials, if it doesn't look, the screen doesn't look, you can't find the tools, that's typically what I do is work in Essentials Classic. When you open the Illustrator, you should get a pop-up asking you for a new file. I'll just go File and New to open something up. One thing to note about working with the laser cutter is that we definitely want to change the color mode from CMYK to RGB. Okay, so we're going to be using specific color functions to assign different power levels, or if it's a raster or a vector cutout in the laser. So you want to make sure you're working in RGB. And I'm just going to switch to inches because I feel like it's a lot easier. And we can just keep 8.5 by 11. The laser platform, or the paper size that we're going to be working with is 18 by 24. So when you start working on those, files, we can scale up to our artboard will be 18 by 24. And then raster graphics, if we are going to be using raster graphics, I definitely recommend keeping this at high. If it's lower, it'll become really pixelated. So if we hit create, we should get our artboard. So this is considered the artboard. If you ever need to edit the artboard, under properties, you can find edit artboard here, and you can change the size and dimension of your project there. So to work with these sort of graphics, let's just start by simply using some text, because I think it's a great way to illustrate how this can work. So if I just have this text form here, it's very, very small. Let's make it quite a lot larger. This right now is essentially a raster graphic, meaning if I were to send this to the laser cutter, it wouldn't see it as a line to cut out. It would see it as something that it would want to etch into the surface. And one way that you can check to see how the laser is going to read this is the Pathfinder view. And so that can be done simply by hitting Command Y. You can see what the Pathfinder view is. It looks just like it does in the other view here. So it's going to read it as a raster sort of an image. It's going to want to use the laser to etch across the surface and just make that look like a print on the surface of the page. If we wanted to make this a vector image, first of all, I've got my text in here. We have two different types of selection tools, right? So this selection tool allows you to select the object in and of itself. Once it's vectorized, the direct selection tool allows you to access individual points within that object, okay? So if you're moving just general objects around, you use this selection tool. If you want to move individual points, you use the direct selection tool. So with the selection tool selected, you can scale this. If I just move this, it will distort it. If I hit shift, it will keep it in proportion with itself. Okay, so that's just basic scaling in Illustrator. If I want to convert this to lines, I need to go to type. Okay, and this is only for text, by the way. All right, and create outlines. Okay, so type create outlines now turns this into a vector form, right? So now if I were to hit Command Y, which is that Pathfinder view, right? Now you can see the lines around the text, okay? And I can also see the individual points of the text in and of itself. Okay, so think about this way. The laser is simply following these points and cutting along the assigned lines for that path, right? So the reason why we create vectors, well, for one thing is they're scalable, right? If you think about this image and if we blow this up, right? It doesn't matter what size this is because the T is just following this point in space to this point in space to create the form, right? So no matter how big a scale or small the scale is, that constant of those points in space and the lines that connect them is going to remain true in proportion with itself, right? So it's different than a raster graphic, which is made up of a finite amount of pixels. And if you blow that up, those pixels are going to get larger and you'll see them more apparent. The vector is made up of points and lines in space. And so it doesn't matter the scale of it. You can enlarge it or shrink it in many different ways. So this is why we use vector graphics for advertising, for branding, for typography, for all kinds of things like that, because if you print it on the side of a product, it can be crisp and concise. If you blow it up the size of IKEA's billboards, right, then it stays the same. So you don't lose any resolution from it. And so, but when we're thinking about it in terms of a machine, it is, again, just following these points in space to cut that out, right? So that's an important consideration for us to think about. Now, again, with the selection tools, I'm back into to my path mode. I'm going to go back to my normal mode. We have a few things with a vector graphic that we can work with. So if I have this selected with the selection tool, you'll notice over here on the appearance, I have a fill and I have a stroke, okay? So the fill is the color that's inside of this, right? So you can change it from any color that you're working with. For us, we're mostly gonna be working with black, right? If we're gonna be rastering this, or none if we wanna just see it as a transparent. But the fill is something with this that just is inside of those lines that we've created. The stroke is the weight of the line around it. So if I give it a 1-point stroke in black and I take my fill and make it none, now you can see I have this, the line has a weight to it. It's a 1-point weight, okay? So if I select this again and I ramp up the stroke, you notice how that stroke weight is getting bigger and bigger, right? So that can determine how your image looks or how your vector looks based on the fill and the stroke. Now, the stroke in and of itself is just an assignment of the line weight and the color, right? But if we go back to that path view, notice how it still looks like our original form, right? So it's not something that the laser is going to see if you're simply changing, oops, sorry, wrong one. I oftentimes hit Command T instead of Command Y. The laser is not going to see this because it's just an assignment of that algorithm to how it fits those lines, right? So if I wanted to have the text cut out in that line form like that, let's just ramp this down a little bit more. You can see it a little bit more clearly. I want to make sure, if I want to trace the outline of the stroke, you can definitely do that. I want to make sure that the fill is none. And then if I go to Object and Path and Outline Stroke, it's going to do just what that sounds like. So it's going to outline the exterior of the stroke. And now you see the difference in the path when I hit Command Y. Now I have a double line, right? I have the outside of the line and the inside of the line, right? So that's an important distinction when we're trying to work with these vector graphics, is kind of thinking about how we're using the stroke, if it's just a singular cut, or if we want to outline the stroke, kind of work it back and forth that way. Now, the other thing that we can do with an object is, once we have a vector path, we can edit it with a direct selection tool. So if I zoom in here, if I wanted to change the T, I could select individual anchor points and I could stretch them and move them, right? So this would be a way that you could take a text form or an object form and you could make it more individualized. And so this is altering the path that we're creating, right? And so, you know, very simply, I can make a more dramatic text form by just simply arranging those points, okay? So that's kind of the basics of working with the vector graphics. Again, we're kind of working between the path view, this, okay? This directs, the selection tool allows you to select an entire object. The direct selection tool allows you to activate individual points. And right now, this is actually a group of forms, right? If I wanted to work on, if I wanted to move this around, let's say, and work individually, let's just go back to my normal view. You can go to under properties. When this is selected, you can go to ungroup, okay? So if I hit ungroup now I can select individual. I can just select the T and I can move this somewhere else. And I can move this somewhere else, and I can move this somewhere else. So now I've got individuals to work with, right? So if this was, you know, something that I could also rotate these a little bit if I needed to. So this gives you a way that you can work with those functions. Now, if I wanted to regroup that, you can totally do that. So I can select all of these things, just drag over them. And then here you can hit group. And now I can work with this as an individual, okay? So grouping and ungrouping can be an important way to work with these forms. Okay, I'm gonna scale this down and let's talk a little bit about working with some basic shapes. That's kind of another way that you may wanna work in Illustrator, especially for this laser cut project. So here we have some basic shapes, rectangles, rounded rectangle, ellipses, polygons, things like that. This, when you draw with it, it's automatically gonna give you a path and it'll typically just have a fill without a stroke. So if I create a rectangle like this, again, it's gonna add a fill. If I go no fill, and if I give it a stroke of 1 point, now we have our vector graphic. And if we hit the path view, Command Y, you can see that it's gonna cut out the form just like that. Now, if I wanted to add to this, I could do so by just simply taking another shape, let's say a circle, and drawing it over the top. And here we have, again, no fill, single stroke there. But notice, if imagine if I was to cut this out, you would have this piece that cuts out, this piece where they cross over, and then this piece as well. So the laser would cut through those pieces together. One way that we can work with just the outline of some of these things is with the different path finders. So when you have two objects selected that are overlapping each other, you can go to the path finder here, and there's different modes that you can choose from. This one joins them together. It's called Unite. So if you click this, now it removes that interior shape. And again, with our Pathfinder view, you can see that this would just cut out the outline view, right? So this can be a way that if you're thinking about working with, you know, a series of forms that you want to build up into a shape, you can just simply add forms, right? Select all of them together, go to Pathfinder and link them up, and you can start to create those forms in that way. Now, if I wanted to take something like this and also make a hole in the middle of it, I could definitely do that as well. So if I take like the rounded ellipse, for example, add this in here and select these two, it's not going to look much different. Like right now, this would be fine to laser cut, right? Like it would work. But you know, you can also hit this function, which would then take that piece out of it, and now it's just that form. And the way that to think about that would be, I can add a fill to this now, and it has that negative cutout, right? Whereas before, if I just hit undo, there we go. If I add a fill to these, notice that it's black, right? Because the vectors, this is recognizing that this is a filled area, this is a shape, and this is a shape within it. Again, the laser cutter could cut that out, but when you're visualizing this, I think it's easier if you were to remove that piece out of it to be able to see how it functions as a form, okay? How are we doing so far with this? Pretty straightforward? Okay, so those are some basic functions. There's all kinds of other types of tools that you can use. Sometimes folks like to just grab a paintbrush and just start working. And so just note that if you were to do this, if you were to start drawing some shapes, let's say like this, right? These are all vector lines as well. So if I hit Command Y, notice how this just becomes a bunch of scribbly lines, which, you know, you could definitely use this to cut things out with. But if you wanted to kind of like create a form with this, if I wanted to start to, I don't know, create some sort of scribbly sort of shape, what I would need to do with this is select all of this stuff, right? See all of the lines that are in there. The next thing I would do is go to Object and Path and outline the stroke. That way I have not the line in the center of this, but rather on the outsides of it. So that makes it way more complex. But then if I use Pathfinder and unite all of this, now I have a vector form that could become a cutout. Does that make sense? So sometimes if you want to work more directly, you can certainly add up a lot of elements to create a Pathfinder form, right? So, you know, there'd be a lot of negative spaces that cut out, but ultimately this piece you could have cut out based on those kind of more scribbly lines that I was drawing with, right? So we're going to be, when we're working with Illustrator, we're going to be building text and forms and objects and drawing. But ultimately, this Pathfinder view is going to be the best way that we can understand how the laser is going to recognize this work, and imagining what will cut out and what will remain intact, right? And so you're just wanting to look for areas where there's crossover or paths that work that intertwine into one another.